Minecraft's default character, Steve, was created by the Swedish developer Marcus Persson, aka Notch. In May of 2009, Notch released the first version of Minecraft, and Steve became the first playable character. And that is the start of our journey. In late 2011, Notch handed development of Minecraft to Jens Bergensen, aka Jeb. Jeb became the lead designer and expanded Minecraft's code, adding new biomes, redstone features, and the end. Jeb took creative control on December 2nd, 2011, while Notch stepped back to focus on other projects. Mojang, the studio founded by Notch, was sold to Microsoft in September of 2014 for $2.5 billion. After this deal, Minecraft became part of Microsoft's gaming division alongside Windows and Xbox. Microsoft made Minecraft the best-selling video game in history, surpassing 300 million copies by 2023. Microsoft is such a huge company and is one of the biggest turning points in this timeline. Microsoft was co-founded in 1975 by Bill Gates and Paul Allen. Bill Gates served as CEO and later as executive, driving Microsoft's role in personal computing with products like Windows, Office, and the Xbox, which now owns Minecraft. Bill Gates oversaw Minecraft's growth through a trillion-dollar company and remained as executor until 2014, the same year Mojang was acquired. Bill Gates shared a long, complicated relationship with Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple. They competed and collaborated for decades. Microsoft created early software for Apple computers back in the 1980s, and both companies helped shape the modern tech world. The two appeared together in a rare interview at the 2007 D5 conference, reflecting the rivalry and shared history, while also making progress towards George Washington. From here, Steve Jobs wasn't just a fan of Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan's music was one of the biggest influences on Steve Jobs' personality. Steve Jobs grew up listening to Bob Dylan in the 60s, collected rare recordings, and followed him on tour. When Steve Jobs founded Apple, he often talked about how much Bob Dylan's attitude towards breaking the rules shaped his idea about technology. Steve Jobs eventually met Bob Dylan in person in the 1980s, and even though the meeting was private, Steve later said it meant a lot to him. The connection is built on communication and admiration. Bob Dylan and George Harrison, a member of the Beatles, had a close, personal friendship that lasted for decades. They first met in 1964, and George Harrison looked up to Dylan as both a musician and a writer. They ended up collabing many times. For example, they collabed in 1971 at a concert for Bangladesh. Their relationship was not just musical. They spent a lot of time together privately. George Harrison said that Dylan changed the way he thought about songwriting. Harrison was one of Dylan's closest friends, making a strong connection. Before the Beatles ever met Elvis, he was one of their biggest inspirations. But the important connection happened on August 26, 1965, when the Beatles visited Elvis at his home in Los Angeles. They played music together and talked about the level of fame they were at. George Harrison later said he never forgot about the meeting because Elvis had such a huge impact on him growing up. This is a real, documented connection and made history, and Elvis is where these connections really get somewhere. In 1970, Elvis flew to George Washington, D.C. on his own and requested an emergency meeting with President Richard Nixon. The meeting actually happened on December 21st. Elvis met Richard Nixon in the Oval Office, gave him a gift, and asked to be named an official federal agent in the war on drugs. There's a famous photo of them shaking hands, and the meeting is extremely well recorded. It is one of the most surprising presidential moments in US history, and a crazy link. Next, Richard Nixon spent 8 whole years working under Dwight D. Eisenhower as his vice president. They traveled together, handled some of the Cold War problems, and Nixon often stepped in for Eisenhower on big international problems. Eisenhower basically trained Nixon on how the White House worked. Their partnership was super close and is actually pretty well recorded. So far, we've gone from a video game character to a president. Let that sink in. Next, Dwight D. Eisenhower's whole career changed because a guy named Franklin D. Roosevelt picked him up during World War II. In 1943, Franklin Roosevelt personally promoted Eisenhower to Supreme Allied Commander, which is the guy in charge of all the Allied forces in Europe. Eisenhower followed Roosevelt's orders and planned D-Day, a day where Allied forces launched a massive invasion on France during World War II. The connection between Eisenhower and Roosevelt was huge and literally changed history. George Washington is just getting closer and closer. The next connection comes from close relatives. Franklin D. Roosevelt and Theodore Roosevelt were literally family. They were fifth cousins, and Franklin Roosevelt even married Theodore's niece, a girl named Eleanor. Franklin Roosevelt looked up to Theodore his whole life. He copied some of Theodore's leadership style and his energy. This connection is personal and 100% real. Our next piece of the timeline is a huge piece of this entire story towards George Washington. Before Theodore Roosevelt became president, he wrote a lot about famous American leaders. One of the people he studied closely was Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general who won the Civil War and later became president. Theodore admired Grant's work and his leadership. He even gave speeches talking about Grant's work and even helped him build up Grant's reputation for future generations. The connection is through writing and political history. After Grant protected the land for the future, John Muir, a nature writer, took those ideas Grant had and went with them. Muir spent his life trying to protect forests, mountains, and national parks for the future. And even though Grant and Muir never actually met, Grant's early work made a path that John took. Grant helped protect the land, and John helped with that idea. John Muir didn't just like Ralph Waldo Emerson, he loved him. John memorized his writing when he was young, and Ralph was one of his biggest inspirations. Then, in 1871, something crazy happened. Ralph visited Yellowstone, where John was living. They met in person and talked about nature and writing, and Ralph encouraged John to keep going. It was a short meeting, but it was very important for John and motivated him even more. Before we get to one of the biggest turning points in history towards George Washington, we have to talk about someone who is a huge piece of the timeline, Henry Davis Thoreau. Henry was very inspired by Ralph and even lived in the same town and influenced each other's writing. Ralph gave advice and new ideas. Some of Henry's most famous writing came from this period. This is one of the strongest connections in the whole chain. Henry read Thomas Carlyle's writing, wrote about it, and talked about it with Ralph. Thomas wrote about leadership, society, and character. Henry did not actually meet Thomas in person, but he studied and reacted to Thomas's writing. Henry became the perfect connection for this whole story. Next up is Thomas Carlyle's biggest obsession, and someone you might know pretty well. Thomas spent a huge part of his career studying major leaders, and Napoleon was basically his top example. He wrote books and lectures about him, showing how people thought about Napoleon even after he died. Even though they were not alive at the same time, Thomas connected himself to Napoleon through research. Now, we have an entire piece of history, and the last part before we get to George Washington. Napoleon grew up right after the American Revolution shook the entire world. France helped the US during the war, and America helped start the French Revolution, the event that made Napoleon get his power. In school, Napoleon studied George Washington and America. So the American Revolution made the world Napoleon was born in and influenced him growing up. And now, we reach the very end of this timeline. We have reached George Washington, through war, to influence, to music, to politics, all the way to Steve, from Minecraft. All made from a single guy, Marcus Pearson, aka Notch. From Elvis to Napoleon, we made a chain over decades, and through 20 different pieces of a timeline. Thank you so much for watching, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video so you can see when I upload another video like this again.